Okay, hello everyone. Good to be back with you in the amazing 60s. So last time we had just finished talking about, I think it was the Supreme Court, yes, the Warren Court here, and just how revolutionary the Supreme Court was at that particular time. Um, Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen. I'm not getting it right. Yeah, the Supreme Court, since the days of Franklin Roosevelt, since 1937, when he gets his first appointment, Hugo Black, uh, FDR was able to nominate 8 justices to the court. I forget how many Truman had, but he's a Democrat as well. Eisenhower had 4 nominees, but 2 of them were super liberal. It was uh, Justice Brennan and forgive me, I forget the other one, but there was another pretty liberal one. And so really you only had one Republican president in some 40-year period, and the Supreme Court became exceedingly liberal and started looking at America and saying, this is wrong, we're going to reinterpret parts of the Constitution to nullify certain actions of the state that we think are terrible. States aren't obeying, these old English common law practices that they had in the Middle Ages in England, like your right to not have your property searched without a warrant, like your right to an attorney. And then they created a lot of new rights. Let's be frank, birth control is nowhere in the Constitution. The idea is laughable that Madison would have thought of that. Technology didn't exist back then, but it was this new jurisprudence felt that the Constitution was a living, breathing document that evolved over time. No one's right or wrong about these things. They're just theories. They're legal theories. The Supreme Court took a very liberal stance in the 60s. They felt it was sort of dragging America into the modern era, and conservatives felt that it was impinging on the rights of the states, that it was a lot of social experimentation, and that it was unnecessary. And who elected these judges anyway, right? Everyone complains about the Supreme Court when their side's losing, right? In the 20s, liberals went crazy saying, why is the Supreme Court striking down every economic regulation as some sort of abridgment on freedom? Well, that's how conservatives imagine liberty is that it's business freedom, right? Liberals tend to think of the autonomy of your body, sort of those kind of rights. And so whatever persuasion is on the Supreme Court at any given time, the other side goes crazy and says, who elected you? Why are you nullifying all these state laws? And this is tyranny, etc. So this happens, certainly. And it alienated a lot of people. Remember that there were a lot of working class Democrats, Irish Catholic, Italian Catholic, Polish Catholic, who were working class. They weren't super rich, but they were Democrats because they were New Deal Democrats. They were in a union, but they had pretty conservative ideas about crime, about reading the Bible in schools. And so this drove a wedge right in the middle of the Democratic Party, where some people who had been liberal their whole lives started to say, Democratic Party is not for me anymore. And so the defections are small at first in the 60s, but by the 80s, there's going to be a group of people called Reagan Democrats who are typically union and working class workers, but for social reasons, they vote Republican because they're socially conservative. And this movement as well turned off a lot of sort of mainstream Americans who had been Democrats forever, and that was the counterculture movement, also known as the hippie movement. So hippies, when I was younger, I thought, hippies were kind of cool. Then I got older and started studying them a bit more, and they seem a lot like sort of frustrated rich kids who just were spoiled brats, a lot of them. I hate to pigeonhole the movement, but that's kind of my interpretation of it now. It was a lot of baby boomers who were coming of age, turning 20 years old in 1966. And a lot of them decided, I don't want my life pre-programmed for me. Like we listen to that song, Little Boxes, about how you're born in a hospital and put into a home that looks the same as everyone else in a school, etc. And you just replicate this pattern that's predetermined for you. And there started to be this explosion of a movement where young people started to experiment with different ways of living. Reminds me a lot of the apocalyptic movements of the 1840s. If you guys remember back, the Church of Latter-day Saints, as it was first constituted in the 1830s and 40s, the Oneidas, the Millerites, the Shakers, the New Harmony, Phalanxes. People were experimenting with actual communism back then, living communally, sharing property together. No one's rich, no one's poor. Then you had some of these weird ones like the Oneidas where they said no monogamous marriage, right? You can, be intimate with anybody and no one will be jealous of each other. The hippie movement, the counterculture movement, tried to sort of recreate that spirit. They basically felt the American way of life, chasing after wealth, chasing after possessions, is a sick, awful way that human beings aren't meant to live this way. And a lot of these young people decided that they were going to try living communally. They were going to sell everything they had, empty their bank accounts, pool their money together, and buy property somewhere in rural America. A lot of it's in upstate New York, right around Woodstock. And they were going to try living that way, growing their own food, fishing, things like that together, and just preparing their own food. No use of money. They wanted to detach themselves from the American system. So that system meant the education system. That they just pre-program you and they brainwash you, man. You got to be free to yourself. Think for yourself. Don't use money. Money makes you attached to the system. Don't go get a job. That makes you just like a slave. It's not me saying that. That's the attitude of the hippies. Sorry, it's getting a little warm. So they tried to do all of that, and they tried to break every convention possible. All these social conventions that said that men should be clean cut. No one really grew a beard in the 50s, right? After the Civil War, beards kind of came back. Notice the founding fathers were all clean shaven. I think the first president with a beard is Lincoln. And then after Lincoln, a lot of them do. Hayes had a beard, Grant had a beard, because they were all Civil War veterans that were out in the field and couldn't shave for 30 days at a stretch. And so beards kind of came back in the late 19th century. And then at the turn of the 20th century, they went away again. In Western civilization, usually the beard represents sort of an uncivilized culture, right? Is that this is the first thing that, Westerners often notice about the Islamic world is men usually grow their beards out quite a bit. And that's often different than Western culture where men usually, shave their faces and they keep their hair cut relatively short. Women typically have their hair longer. The counterculture said, no, we're just going to do whatever we want, right? So men started growing their beards out. They started growing their hair long. There's, in fact, a musical from the 60s called Hair, not Hairspray. That's much later in the 80s, but Hair. And Hair is, it's about the hippie movement. It's about the age of Aquarius, but it's about sort of this wonderful human trait. Hair is beautiful and men should be able to grow it long just like women. So men did. They grew their beards out. They started experimenting with a lot of stuff. A lot of them sort of said, you don't really have to shower every day. Human beings should, stink. And I've heard people in modern times start to say this stuff, right? That we don't need to wear deodorant, that showering every day is actually really bad for your skin. That this is an obsession of Americans to be, clean and not have excess hair. And just, we go through these routines every day and spend a fortune on all these health and beauty products that don't make our lives any better. So we got to free ourselves of that. Throw it all away, man. They got rid of their televisions. They got rid of their radios. They have these weird mantras where they would say, you got to get rid of those things that broadcast in AM and FM. You need to open yourself up to tune into the wavelengths that you can't normally hear, like, love and joy. You can tune into that. And what they would do to tune into it usually would be to take hallucinogenic drugs, marijuana, but also, psychedelic mushrooms. LSD was this new drug, acid, that a lot of people were taking in the 60s to help them attain a higher consciousness, which it probably did not. But they thought that it did. They thought this was kind of a religious experiment. Notice that it's a lot of white middle-class kids rejecting everything their parents want them to do. We don't want Christianity. We don't want, any of the things you handed down to us. We're going to reject everything. They experimented with a lot of like Eastern mysticism, Buddhism, things like that, meditation. And they were just experimenting with different ways of living. A lot of them believed in free love, that love was one of these things that should be shared with everyone. It should not be confined to monogamy. And so kind of the hippie mantra was make love, not war, that sex was a positive good and that there was too much shame involved in sex. And so this really explodes in the summer of 1966. that you didn't really see tie-dye and sandals and, beads and, men with long hair before 1966. It really explodes then, and people start moving into communes and doing that. And really, it doesn't last very long. It pretty much falls apart in the summer of 1969. But the image stays with us forever. People still dress up like hippies for Halloween and all that kind of stuff. So, what can we say is really the influence of the counterculture movement or the hippie movement? They do not inspire a revolution. Americans, by and large, do not flock to the wilderness and join one of these communes. A few thousand do, but by the 70s, most of them left, like they always do. This same thing happened in the 1840s. And when you talk to a lot of these old timers who were hippies in the 60s, they'll tell you, they said, when you're 20 and you're single, it was a fun, interesting time where we were experimenting with new ways of living. But then once I had a kid, it wasn't fun anymore. I couldn't get my kid vaccinated because that was a modern thing, and you had to have your kid born in a hospital, and have money and stuff. And it wasn't fun anymore at that point. A lot of them will tell you, and they'll say, I had a kid, and after the kid turned 1 or 2, I just decided that this was not a good way for them to live. And so most of those communes are shut down and people abandon it because they miss modern comforts. Modern life is very comfortable. It's nice to be able to live in a home where you can change the temperature to the exact degree that you want and have electricity and entertainment and all these wonderful things. And so it largely fell apart then. But it would change America forever. Okay, I grew out my beard. I'm, started going bald in my 20s, and I thought I got to have some hair on my face. I might as well, grow my beard out. What's wrong with that? You should be able to. And fashions have very much changed. If you haven't noticed, Americans are, forgive me, we're a bit of slobs when it comes to how we dress. If you travel to almost any other country, it's not acceptable to wear New Balance tennis shoes in public. You look like a bum. Right? They don't wear shorts in most other countries. The hottest countries in the world, in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, they think it's disrespectful to go around and wear shorts. Americans are all about comfort. How often have you guys been to Walmart on like a Sunday morning and seen someone in their Duck Dynasty PJs and they find that acceptable? Curlers all in their hair. Americans used to be obsessed with like looking nice. You had to wear your Sunday best every day. As I've told you many times, men had to wear suit, jacket, tie, nice shoes, not tennis shoes, nice leather shoes every single day, which makes you wonder, what did they wear when they had to dress up nice? Because they dressed up nice every single day. Ladies wore dresses every single day. You did not wear tennis shoes. Ladies did not go out bare-legged. They had to wear stockings. This was a rigid social system that fell apart in the 60s. My mother, who was, born in Missouri, but moved to California when she was a little girl, she begged her mother, why can't I wear sandals? It's hot in Los Angeles all the time. Why am I wearing these nice leather shoes? All my friends are wearing this. And my grandmother, felt, and she was raised to believe that poor folks in the third world wear sandals because they're too poor to afford nice shoes. They get hookworm and ringworm and stuff because they're walking around barefoot, right? So you're a civilized person in a civilized country, have respect, wear shoes. This is a big fight that a lot of parents had. And eventually the baby boomers won. They just wore down their parents. A lot of it had to do with rock and roll. Don't listen to this music, so they did it anyway, right? Don't wear those sandals. I'm going to wear them anyway. Hey, go get a haircut. I'm going to grow out my hair long. And so these things actually do change. Pretty much most of us live the traditional American lifestyle where we have a 9-to-5 job, we live in a home, we pay our bills, we have a bank account, and we don't rebel against that. We basically embrace it. But most of us do believe that it's way too stuffy of an environment to not be able to dress how you want and be who you want. Okay, think about tattoos. When I was a kid in the 80s, it was only dangerous people who had been to prison or been in gangs had tattoos. I mean, it meant if you saw someone with a tattoo, you were like, whoa, stay away from that person. That person's legit. Don't mess with them. Everybody gets tattooed. Almost everyone under the age of 35 and over 18 pretty much in America has a tattoo. I think it's like 1 out of 3 or something like that in that age bracket, which is pretty substantial. It doesn't mean anything anymore. In the 80s, if you had a visible tattoo on your neck or your hands, you would never get hired anywhere. Now it doesn't matter. Nobody cares. This has changed America, and the hippies were the first to kind of push the boundaries of everything, of what was acceptable in music and how we dress and how we behaved. we don't embrace the idea of free love in terms of, you know, you can go to bed with whomever you want, but it's more acceptable in American society today to, shall we say, explore monogamy, right? That's basically what Americans do, is they partner up with a boyfriend, girlfriend. They might engage in premarital sex, but typically it's not acceptable to cheat in that respect. And that's still, you know, very much the paradigm in America, but it's uncommon today to, let's say, you know, not cohabitate before you're married. That used to be the biggest shame of all, to live together with someone before they were married. Virtually everybody does that today, and we don't bat an eye. We owe that to the hippies. They push back against every social norm and change them. Now, is this better? Is it worse? That's not for me to say. There's certainly some negative consequences, is that it's much more common to get divorced now. It's much more common to have kids out of wedlock today. Is this something we should celebrate? I don't necessarily think so, but I do like to be able to wear what I want and dress how I can wear my, you know, tennis shoes to work, and it's no big deal. And I thank the hippies for that. So what eventually killed this movement was the summer of 1969. In the summer of 1969, Charles Manson in Los Angeles and his family, his cult, murdered a bunch of people in the Hollywood Hills. And now that we have the Quentin Tarantino movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you can see kind of an alternate reality. What if the Manson murders didn't happen and Leo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt killed them all, right? That did not happen in reality. This sort of hippie cult broke into Roman Polanski's home, who was a famous Hollywood director, and murdered his pregnant wife and all of her house guests brutally, and then tried to blame it on black radicals, the Black Panthers. They murdered these rich white people and painted in blood the word pigs all over the wall, hoping it would create this race war that eventually would bring about end times. Charlie Manson was crazy. He took a lot of drugs that fried his brain, and he believed that this was, you know, the reality he was trying to bring about. And then the trial happened, which was the most public trial in human history, lasted over a year. And everybody saw every day these cult members go to court and act crazy. And sort of mainstream America could point at that and say, you see, when you start tearing down institutions of tradition, this is what it leads to. You may think it's silly that we all dress nice and have polite manners and don't say the F word in public. Hippies say, why are you so uptight? Let's break that. This is what it leads to, is the complete breakdown of society, and just even murder would be acceptable. And it wasn't funny anymore. It was kind of funny in 1966. If you were a young couple and you were driving, you know, across America and you saw a guy with a guitar hitchhiking, hey, let's pick that guy up. He's funny. He's a hippie. 1969, the feeling was, it's not funny anymore. I'm not going to pick up that guy. He's probably a mass murderer. Think about how much this has changed. It was very common before 1969 to hitchhike in this country. I mean, my parents told me when they first met in 1970, they went on a road trip together. They got to wherever they were going. I think they went to Vegas together. And when they got there were no hotel rooms. They went to like 6 different hotels and they were all booked up. And so what they did to me is the most insane thing I've ever heard in my life. And this was completely normal. They drove to the local radio station. They waited in the lobby and said, you know, we're from out of town. There's no place for us to stay. We'd like to meet the DJ. They then got to meet the DJ when he was off air. And they said, could you please broadcast? We're Alan and Teresa, and we're visiting from Los Angeles, and we'd like a place to stay for the night. Could you please broadcast over the air? And then someone can call in the studio and we can stay with them. And that is what they did. And to me, that is the most insane thing I've ever heard. Would you guys do that today? I mean, especially ladies, would you do that? Does that sound like a sane thing to do, to just travel and go to a record, or a radio station and ask them to broadcast? What kind of weirdos and freaks are going to call into the station to have you stay at their house? But amazingly, in the 50s, you didn't really have many of those negative consequences, murders or anything like that. People just hitchhiked. People just did those things. It was a more innocent kind of time. 1969 exploded all of that. The other thing that happened that summer, well, there's a couple of things that happened. One was the moon landing, which was incredible. And people wept tears and said, humankind has achieved the most incredible thing ever. And it was Americans as the representatives of humans who explored outer space and landed on the moon and drove around. It was amazing. And And Woodstock happened, sort of the penultimate representation of the hippie movement. Not just a concert, but 3 days of peace, love, and music. It was a festival of sort of a sharing of this hippie culture to people. They tried to recreate it on the West Coast in the fall at Altamont up near Sacramento. And someone was stabbed to death. There was a riot. People were no longer, smoking marijuana and just hanging out and being peaceful. People were taking speed and getting really agitated and angry and taking uppers like cocaine and stuff like that, and getting in fights and having riots and killing people. Literally, someone was stabbed to death in front of the stage while the Rolling Stones were playing Sympathy for the Devil, very ironically. And so these things combined basically ended the hippie movement. Altamont and the Charles Manson murders, and basically the hippie movement disintegrated in the next years. In the early 70s, people walked away from the communes and it was over. But it would always change America. Then we got Vietnam. Now, Vietnam in and of itself is such a huge topic. I used to have a whole lecture just on Vietnam, and then I realized after a few years that it was way too detailed, and most of that information would not be on the AP test. Every generation kind of gets the war of its culture, right? World War II was this war that universally everyone embraced, certainly after Pearl Harbor, and was proud of their service and was honored to serve their country and save the world. But there have been other wars that Americans were very divided over. The Mexican War, Northerners basically felt it was a war to steal land for slavery. And so it was very controversial. The War of 1812, New England didn't want to fight in it. This war, just as we speak, Joe Biden just gave a speech yesterday saying we are leaving Afghanistan. And I have very mixed feelings about this. I can remember when the war broke out, I was against it initially. Most people felt, well, we got to go in and get the Taliban. And I felt, what's our exit strategy? I definitely want that government toppled, but I don't think the solution to terrorism is invading other countries and overthrowing their governments, because then we're responsible for it, right? We have to stay forever and ensure that that government is stable. Instead, we should invest in security on our own shores. We could have prevented 9/11 with simple security measures. That's my little humble opinion. But once we got into Afghanistan, it was, a bog. It was a quagmire. It was quicksand. We got our feet in and we couldn't get out. 20 years now. And it blows my mind that you guys were not even yet born when that war began. I was 22. I still had all my hair when that war started. I was really scared I'd get drafted for that war. Now I'm 42. No way I'll be drafted now. I'm way beyond that age. And I think my feelings are kind of like the rest of America and the world. If we were going to be able to win this war, we would have won it already. It's unwinnable. We just can't. The Taliban just sneaks across the border into Pakistan whenever the heat gets too much. We cannot go in there after them. And then we retreat back to our bases, and then the Taliban sneaks across the border again and causes havoc. It's very much like Vietnam. And we eventually got tired and we left. Vietnam was very much like that war, Afghanistan, but much more intense, much larger, and much greater cost. Afghanistan, if you look at the total casualties, it's relatively small. Last time I looked, it was between 4,000 and 5,000 Americans have died in Afghanistan, which is horrible, but 500 a year. More Americans die from training accidents in the military than those casualties. So it's not a real high casualty war. It's just endless, and it's expensive, and it's exhausting, and it's counterproductive. It makes the Islamic world angry at us because we're over there trying to exert force. Vietnam, very much the same way. It was an episode of the Cold War, certainly, but there was a lot of misunderstandings that Americans had about Vietnam. So little history of Vietnam. Vietnam was a French colony during the age of imperialism. The French got in there in the mid-19th century and put down roots and took over the plantations and taught everybody French and converted a quarter of the population to Roman Catholicism and set up shop there, built rubber plantations and mines in the mountains, and controlled not only Vietnam, but Laos and Cambodia. They were eventually kicked out by the Japanese in 1941 because France had been invaded and occupied by the Germans, by the Nazis. And so the Japanese swooped in and took it over, and then Japan would lose World War II. And like so much of Asia and the rest of the world, what do we do with this area? Do we bring the French back, or do we grant independence to the Vietnamese? Well, before the French came back, In some ways, they never left. Their military was conquered, but there were still French landowners and shopkeepers. There was very much a French footprint in Vietnam and would remain. When you go and order banh mi's, why are the Vietnamese eating sandwiches with baguettes? Well, who has baguettes? The French brought that, to Vietnam, and still to this day, it's in the culture and in the cuisine. So in a way, they never left. In fact, they give the language to the Vietnamese, not the oral language, but the written language. The Vietnamese used to use Chinese characters for their alphabet, and the French changed that. If you notice, you ever think it's weird that there's this Asian country that has Roman letters in their alphabet? It's quite strange. You can actually, if you can read English, you can kind of make out Vietnamese words because they're written with Roman characters. But pretty much the French presence is gone after 1941, the military presence. There's a nationalist leader by the name of Ho Chi Minh that declares independence in September of 45. The minute that the Japanese surrender, he assumes power. He just sort of says, I'm the new leader, because he ran this party called the ICP, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. And he says, I'm claiming Vietnam for the Vietnamese. We're independent now. Well, the rest of the world would have something to say about that. The British had something to say about it. The Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek, this is before Mao Zedong took over. So the Chinese nationalists had something to say about it. The Americans had something to say about it, and the French did too. And so through various negotiations, the French were allowed to come back in. Ho Chi Minh did not want them there. The Vietnamese certainly didn't want them there, but they came back in. For 9 years, they tried to subdue the country and bring it back under their control. And in some ways they did. They controlled the cities, they controlled huge parts of the country, but they couldn't control the entire countryside. There were these rebel groups, guerrilla fighters in the jungles called the Viet Minh, who were basically resistance fighters. They were fighting to get the French out. They certainly were communist because that was who their leadership were, but they saw this as sort of a national liberation struggle like the American Revolution. Why should the French be over here telling us what to do? Leave. And we told them to leave, but they did not want to. They decided they were going to stay. And President Truman decided France was a rich country. It was a powerful country. It was a well-developed country. It's in Europe. We needed them on our side. So we had to just back off and let them do this. Otherwise, they wouldn't join NATO or join the Marshall Plan or anything else. So the French decided to stay for 9 years. They would eventually lose. And in 1954, they went home. They were humiliated at Dien Bien Phu. There was this large siege in the north of Vietnam that they lost. And they were humiliated and went home with their tail between their legs, essentially. Now, in 1954, America had a wonderful opportunity just to wash its hands of this whole embarrassing mess and just to go home and say, forget it. It's not worth it. And we decided not to do that. The whole world decided that Vietnam would be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, that the communists would go to the north, the French would go to the south, but this was just a ceasefire. And in 2 years' time, the French would totally leave. There'd be national elections and Vietnam would be reunited. It was not to be. The moment that the Geneva Conference is signed and all the powers agreed to it, America said, we don't agree to this, and we're just going to do whatever the heck we want to do. And as the French were trying to remove themselves from the South, we decided to come in and start a presence. The CIA and the State Department hand-selected the leader of South Vietnam. He was a Vietnamese nationalist by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem. He had fled Vietnam after the French lost, essentially. He went to New Jersey and was living in a convent there as a Catholic, and he was hand-selected by the CIA to basically be the leader of this country. The idea being, well, at least we could save half of Vietnam. The communists are in the north. We could just install this leader, give him money, weapons, training for his soldiers' support, and we can create a country out of nothing. And amazingly, they did. For 21 years, we created a country, but it was completely unsustainable. We were seen, as we were, installing this leader, as the puppet master, as a colonial presence, as the French just, reimagined. Oh, here's more white people from overseas who are coming here telling us what to do. Now, I want to be very clear. America was not there like the French were to reclaim a colony. We weren't taking up the land and the rubber plantations and the mineral wealth. The US got no money or really anything out of this. It was purely geopolitical. We wanted to stop communism from spreading into another region. It was containment, but it was not very strategic. Anyone could tell you that Vietnam was a poor country, a pretty weak country, and that it was probably not savable, that the only political movement on the ground that had any credibility was the communists, because they had fought the French, they had fought the Japanese, they had fought the Chinese before that, and they liberated the country from the French, and now they were fighting us. And it was very easy for them to say, this is just another outsider group telling us what to do. It fit into Vietnam's long history of struggling against, domination. And so starting in 1954, rebels continue their fight. The Viet Minh continue their fight against this new regime. At first, we just sort of back Ngo Dinh Diem indirectly, and it becomes unsustainable. By 1965, the country was falling apart. Really, by 1964, the country was falling apart. Lyndon Johnson was terrified in the summer of 64 that he was going to lose to Barry Goldwater. Now, he would destroy Goldwater in a huge landslide, but imagine you're running for president, you're helping Vietnam, and it collapses to communism just a few months before the election. It would have been very much like everybody blamed Truman for, quote, losing China in 1949, and he had to leave office and all the struggles over the Korean War. And so Johnson said, I'll be darned if I'm going to lose a country to communism. So he decided to do everything he could to prop up this country. Problem was, he needed a reason. He couldn't just send in troops. He needed sort of authorization from the Congress. So the government staged this kind of crazy incident, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. 2 destroyers, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, in the Gulf of Tonkin, were actually stirring up trouble. They were offering support for South Vietnamese commandos that had launched these incursions into North Vietnam. These 2 destroyers were in North Vietnamese waters, violating international law, and North Vietnamese patrol boat, went after them and shot at them with a machine gun, and the bullets just bounced off the hull harmlessly. And this was the incident that started the Vietnam War, right? I want you to imagine back to World War II, when the Germans were actually sinking our destroyers and killing American sailors, hundreds of them, and FDR still did not ask for a declaration of war on Germany. This was a harmless incident that was cooked up into this huge conspiracy of North Vietnam and China attacking us for no reason in the Gulf of Tonkin. And so this is one of the beginning moments where Americans start to say, our government is not pure and perfect. Our government lies just like other governments. They stage incidents, false flag operations to whip up popular opinion. The vote in the Congress was, in the House, 435 to 0. In the Senate, it was 98 to 2. Only 2 senators, Wayne Morse of Oregon and Senator Greening from Alaska, were the only 2 people in the entire Congress that said, no, we're not authorizing the president to send troops to Vietnam. And they didn't really do it because they had any sympathy for communism. They just thought, we can't give the president carte blanche just to have an open-ended war whenever he wants. But popular opinion in the 60s was that we had to stop the communists. So people believed the lie, and they supported the president, and the president started to send troops. At first, just 15,000. On March the 8th of 1965, the first Marines land at Da Nang. And at first, they're there just to protect air bases. The logic was, we can win this war just by bombing North Vietnam. That's all we need to do. The bombing will do 2 things. It will, A, create pain in North Vietnam. People don't like getting bombed. And we'll tell them, we'll stop the bombing if you stop supporting the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. Okay, the Viet Minh become the Viet Cong in 1960, and they, reemerge and become a very deadly force against the regime there. 2, interdiction. If you bomb these trails going from North to South Vietnam, you can disrupt supplies and, we'll win the war that way. Well, neither strategy seems to work. Bombing did not break the resolve of the North Vietnamese. It made them more resolved to help their comrades in the South. And interdiction did not work. We filled bomb craters all over Laos and South Vietnam and North Vietnam, and it seemed to have no effect. We would blow up a bridge at 6 a.m. and by noon it was rebuilt. They had 80-year-old grandmas, with bicycles running bags of rice through the jungle from North to South Vietnam. And it was just impossible that we were going to win the war this way. And the air bases became targets for the Viet Cong. In February of 65, a handful of Viet Cong cut the wire, got into Pleiku Air Base, bombed the barracks, and killed a half a dozen airmen there. And so Johnson felt, well, we need to bring in soldiers just to guard the air bases so that the bombings can continue. And the Viet Cong just retreated into the jungle. So Johnson started fanning out these Marines on patrols to go find the Viet Cong in the jungle. And he had to bring in more Marines to guard the air bases so that we could have more patrols. And so every month he kept sneaking in more and more and more and more and more soldiers. And the years start to tick by, 1965, 66, 67. By 1968, there were 550,000 American soldiers in Vietnam, and there was still no end in sight. North Vietnam just kept sending more men and more supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail into South Vietnam, and more of the country got into control by enemy hands. It just did not seem like we could win this conflict. And then the worst moment in the war, the Tet Offensive in January of 68. Right at the moment when the US government said that we were winning the war, that it was going to be over within 6 months, the Viet Cong launched the largest offensive of the entire war. They came out of their tunnels, they came out of the jungle, they marched into the cities, and they took over the radio station in Saigon, the embassy in Saigon, and the citadel in Hue, sort of the symbols of like American and South Vietnamese power. Now, weirdly enough, this was a huge military blunder. The Viet Cong were virtually wiped out. They committed about half of their forces and they were annihilated in this. They did exactly what we wanted them to do. The reason why this war was so frustrating is you'd go in search of the Viet Cong and they wouldn't engage you. You'd step on a landmine, you get sniped at from the bushes in the jungle, and they would just disappear in underground tunnels. You couldn't find them. And we just kept getting frustrated that our helicopters, our machine guns, our napalm, our white phosphorus, it just, all the power in the world wasn't doing any good in this kind of asymmetric guerrilla warfare. Well, in Tet, they came out of their jungles and did exactly what we wanted, and we wiped them out. But politically, the effect was devastating. Americans saw on their television screens open fighting in the streets of Saigon, and they just said, one of two things is happening. Either the government is lying to us. People didn't know yet about the Tet Offensive. That was about the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the lies there. That would come out in the early 70s. But people started to think, they called it the credibility gap, but they felt Lyndon Johnson is not telling us the truth. For 3 years, he said, we're winning the war and it's almost over, just a few more troops and we'll win. And we've doubled down and tripled down, and it's just not happening. So either he's lying or he's a fool and doesn't actually understand what's going on. And either instance is terrifying. So you had kind of two camps in America, but they both had the same conclusion. You had liberals that said this was an immoral, unwinnable war from the beginning, and we never should have been there in the first place. And you had conservatives that said it was a just war, but we can't win it under the current leadership, and we need to just get the heck out. Our chance was in the early 60s, and we blew it, and we need to just get out. And that seems to be the sentiment of most Americans in 1968. Now, the war, in a way, it just, the conditions it was fought under, it was unwinnable. We weren't going to win it like this, trying to just fight the Viet Cong and wear them down. It's like fighting the Taliban. We can kill as many as we want. They're just going to recruit more, and the war will just drag on. As long as our enemy has a patron that will just equip them and arm them, they'll fight till the end of time. We have to fight in their country. We eventually have to go home. They are living in their country. You know, you're not going to outlast insurgents in their own country. And so in 68, this is the big turn. Tet really convinced everybody that this was just not going to work. So Lyndon Johnson announces he is not going to run for re-election. Vietnam basically destroyed his presidency. All the good he did with voting rights and civil rights, nobody cared anymore. All they cared about was that we were being humiliated in Vietnam. We had never lost a war, and we were losing. And you could see it live on TV, and people were mad as hell about it. So in 1968, Hubert Humphrey runs against Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon wins, and people want new leadership, and the Republicans are back in power. We'll get to that later. All right, so then we have the civil rights movement and the left. They go a little crazy in the late 60s, and they alienate their base, the Democratic Party. Prior to 1965, the civil rights movement was largely Southern, religious, that is Christian, and nonviolent. And that very much changed after 1965. The face of the movement prior to 65 was Martin Luther King. He was the only civil rights leader around, basically, the one with the most, credibility. After 1965, you have a slew of leaders who are Northern. They're either irreligious or openly hostile to Christianity, like the Nation of Islam. and there were others like the Shrine of the Black Madonna, and very militant. The mantra of the Black Panthers was not nonviolence, and we want to sit down, with the white man as brothers. It was, kill the pigs, right? It was a much more militant kind of message. They openly carried weapons. They preached self-defense, which is not a bad thing, but that frightened a lot of white folks, black men with guns and berets. It was a little unnerving to people. And this was taking the left in a much different direction. There were many who felt that Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, although great, did not go far enough, and that so much anger had been pent up for so long that they felt this was the moment, the late 60s, a revolutionary moment when we could sort of tear down society and rebuild it and purge it of all the terrible things that were in it and recreate it anew. And probably they were wrong. The mood was just not ripe in the 60s for a revolution. And really, it sort of sabotaged the movement. Moderate whites defected. They said, I don't want any part of this. So the Nation of Islam, for instance, this is an organization that still exists. Last I checked, Louis Farrakhan is still the leader of the Nation of Islam. He's been a member since the 1950s, I think. He's an old man in his late 80s now. And forgive me, I'll give you my own personal feelings. They are kind of a kooky, weird political / cult group where you might be tempted to say, oh, these are Muslims because they're the Black Muslims in Nation of Islam. Kind of, but not really. Most Muslims don't believe that the Black Muslims are actually Muslims as one would understand it. That they believe that Wallace Fard Muhammad, this guy that lived in the 1930s in Detroit, was the reincarnation of Muhammad. No other Muslim believes that. But they preach kind of an interesting ideology. The ideology was that African peoples and the African diaspora is the teachings of the Israelites and the diaspora in the Old Testament, right? Where the Jews are held in captivity in Egypt and then they escape to the Promised Land. And Martin Luther King talked in these tones, but he never talked explicitly about the violence. But he did say, we as a people will get to the Promised Land. That's kind of saying we're the Israelites, we're suffering, we're wandering in the desert now, but after the wandering, we will get to the Promised Land. We'll get to Israel, right? And the Black Muslims kind of took that similar ideology, but they said that's us, that white people are an instrument of the devil. They're created by the devil to torment us, to test our faith, essentially, that we were kidnapped and taken from Africa here, that we were purged of our own religion. We were Muslims in Africa and we were made to be Christians. And our identity was changed. We don't know who we are. Our last name, we're the only ethnic group that was not allowed to keep our last names when we came to America. And so Malcolm X, the most famous leader in this group, he was born Malcolm Little. He went to prison in 1946 and got religion, essentially. He was converted. He got off drugs, he got clean, he swore that he'd never commit crimes again. And then when he got out, he became a powerful spokesman for the Nation of Islam. Under the religion, you change your last name to the letter X, meaning a variable, the unknown. You don't know what your history is. And then you go on this self journey of enlightenment. You meditate, you preach, you try to have faith. And then God, Allah, will give you a vision of what your new name would be, right? Like Muhammad Ali, very famously, heavyweight champion of the world. He was born Cassius Marcellus Clay. He said that was the slave owner who owned my great-great-great-grandfather. I don't adhere to that name. He joined the organization. They changed his name to Cassius X for a brief period. And then he went on the spiritual quest and decided to name himself Muhammad Ali. Now, this was just a fringe organization, but because you had these two dynamic leaders, Malcolm X, who was an amazing speaker, very powerful, and the heavyweight champion of the world. Boxing is not that popular anymore, but it used to be huge in America. It used to be televised on just regular TV, not even on pay-per-view or cable. It was just on regular television. And after every fight, Muhammad Ali would give an interview and he would say, I want all the young Black children in America to buy this newsletter, Muhammad Speaks. It's the official newsletter of the Nation of Islam. And wow, that really frightened a lot of white folks. That young Black people might leave their Baptist and Methodist churches and go join Islam and be incredibly militant and angry at America. The Black Panthers. Here, Black Panthers were formed in 1966. Very telling, right after the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were passed. They were based in Oakland. They had a huge, 10-point plan for ending poverty and oppression in Oakland. They wanted jobs for people. They wanted better education. But above all, police brutality was their biggest complaint. That Oakland had virtually an all-white police force, that they were incredibly brutal. And so they said, what we're going to do is organize sort of civilian patrols. Very militant. If you look, they all dressed in black leather jackets, black jeans, black berets, black sunglasses, and armed with full bandoleras and rifles and shotguns. And they would patrol around in their own cars in Oakland for police brutality. They would police the police. Now, as you might imagine, the police in Oakland did not appreciate that. They were incredibly angry at it. And they tried everything to disrupt the Panthers. They tried to get them disarmed. California actually passed a very strict gun regulation in 1966 because of the Black Panthers, because they always showed up at rallies with guns that terrified people. And so California passed very strict, said you couldn't take a gun on federal property, and you couldn't have, a magazine over a certain capacity, et cetera, et cetera. Notice the discussion's very different when it's white folks who will parade in public with, firearms that's, the Second Amendment, that's fine, right? As soon as this militant black group does it, the government wants to shut it down immediately. Both the FBI and local police went after the Black Panthers all over the country to try to disarm them and arrest them and send them to prison for long sentences, and largely did that. And after the Oakland chapter opens up, it expands all over the country. LA had a chapter of the Black Panthers, Chicago, Newark, New York City, et cetera. Every black neighborhood in America got a chapter of them, and they were very militant and very angry. They would drill all day long and sing in cadence, do these kind of military songs that were terrifying to white folks. And so again, this alienated, moderate whites would march with Martin Luther King. They didn't want any part of this. This terrified them, that this was black nationalism. This was a separatist movement within the US that said, we want armed revolution, and we want, some of these leaders were advocating kind of crazy things, like we want a state within the United States just for black people that we could run for ourselves. And that's the most peaceful solution to this, that we cannot coexist peacefully. So give us our own territory within the US. That was terrifying for the establishment in America. As I said, the FBI and local cops went after them, killed a lot of the leaders in these raids, arrested them, sent them to long prison sentences. And then the riots happened. The long, hot summers, they were known as. Watts was the first. In the summer of 1965, Watts blew up an enormous riot, started over police brutality. And then it happened in every black neighborhood in America, everywhere. Detroit would have the worst in 1967, but every single neighborhood had it. And it very much turned off white people because like today, we argue about this. Can a riot ever be justified? If a population is oppressed and they have no other way to fight back, can they rebel in this way and burn down neighborhoods to get attention for their struggle? Notice there's two different ways to refer to this. Many people in the black community refer to it as the rebellions, that they were justified in rebelling against police brutality to get attention for this issue because it would just go on forever. Most white people refer to it as riots because it's an unlawful kind of thing. Whatever you want to call it, they were very scary, they were very violent, and very, very different than went on last summer. Last summer was largely a bunch of protests that began over police brutality, and some of them did spiral out of control into violence. There was no protest here in the 60s. They didn't start as peaceful marches. They began and ended as rebellions, riots, whatever we call it, as violent entities. The intention was violence. Most of the marches that happened last summer were totally peaceful. I think I read a statistic, 97% of them were peaceful. We had a march in Cyprus, right? I saw it. There were 10 people. It was mostly moms and their kids walking down the street with their masks on saying Black Lives Matter. And that was it. There was no riot in Cyprus, right? And in most neighborhoods, there were no riots or anything like that. And last summer, you had whites and blacks marching together. You didn't see that in the 60s, not in the late 60s. You saw it in 65 in Selma. But when these riots / rebellions happened in the North, there are no white faces in the crowds. And it's very terrifying. And there were dozens of people killed in these riots, millions of dollars of property damage, and the government didn't really know what to do other than just call out the National Guard. And again, it drove that wedge. There were many moderate whites that said, look, I can get behind Martin Luther King and peaceful legislation and changing of the system. I can't get behind armed rebellion and these really militant and violent groups. I just can't be a part of it. And when Martin Luther King got killed, it just got worse. He was killed April 4th, 1968. And then the next day, there were 100 riots in 100 cities all over America. It seemed like people lost all hope. This was the one man that could bring both Black and white America together. He could speak to both populations, and he was killed. And many people started to imagine that maybe he was killed by the government itself. People started to, 5 years after JFK was killed, say, maybe that wasn't what we thought it was initially. Maybe it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. Maybe it was a conspiracy. Then Bobby Kennedy got killed in June. The younger brother was running for president, trying to say, everything went wrong when my brother got killed. We got into Vietnam. The peaceful civil rights movement became violent. I want to bring us all together. And then he was killed. And it was almost like a lack of hope. People just thought that we'll never be able to change the system peacefully. They're killing our leaders. Now, just a moment on this. I'm not one for believing in any of these conspiracy theories, but I get why people do. There's a lot that many Americans don't know about this country. And when people do study it and find out these things, it's kind of terrifying. There is a very fascinating and horrible incident where Martin Luther King, and this might upset some of you, but he was a wonderful man, but not the best husband. It's pretty well established now that he did have affairs and cheat on his wife pretty constantly. And the FBI was looking into him. I mean, it was really amazing. J. Edgar Hoover honestly believed America was the best country in the world and that anyone who complained must be a communist or being aided by the communists, right? Now, why did he believe that? Richard Nixon thought the same thing. Because we were doing it in communist countries, right? We would give money to people in Poland who said, hey, communism's no good. And we would fund those movements secretly through the CIA. And so we naturally assumed that the KGB and the Soviets were behind every malcontent in America. They were behind the hippies. They were behind the Weathermen, the Black Panthers, Students for a Democratic Society. Anyone who's marching in the streets has to be either a communist or they're an unknown agent of the communists who are getting bankrolled. So they looked into Martin Luther King's, bank records. They looked into his history. They wiretapped his phones. They put recorders in his bedroom every night. And they recorded him actually in one of these liaisons with a woman. And then they threatened him. We're still not sure who did this, but some leader at the FBI may have been J. Edgar Hoover, may have been one of his underlings. They mailed him a copy of the tape so he could hear it, and then wrote him a letter basically saying you should kill yourself or we'll release the tape to the press and humiliate you and discredit you, which they never did. Martin Luther King amazingly took the tape to the FBI, to the very agency that was blackmailing him. And this disturbs many people. It disturbs me that the FBI tried to do. Now, it'd probably be inaccurate to say the FBI. So it wasn't the whole organization, but someone in the FBI took that tape and mailed it to him and tried to convince him to kill himself. And so when this comes out and people see that he was killed, people start to say, maybe the FBI killed him, maybe the CIA. There's no evidence of that. There's zero evidence of that. And I want to be very clear because I don't buy into all the conspiracy theories. But people bought into it. They felt that any person that stood up and tried to bring the country together, they were killed. And so people start to lose hope and people start to say, well, we need to get more violent. SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, which had been very peaceful, splintered apart. And part of that group became the Weather Underground, the Weathermen. And they started to bomb locations. They would go down to San Diego Harbor and strap a bunch of TNT to the side of a ship that was about to go to Vietnam and blow a hole in it. They would break into draft office and burn draft records. They did everything they could to try to disrupt the war. Didn't really succeed in that, but they became a terrorist group, basically bombing, organizations. Then, for some people, that organization wasn't violent enough, so they made these crazy organizations like the SLA, the Symbionese Liberation Army, who robbed banks and performed political assassinations. The superintendent of Oakland schools, a black man, was publicly executed. He basically was shot with bullets laced with cyanide for the crime of advocating that school children should have IDs. What was happening was a lot of kids would drop out of high school and sneak in and sell drugs in the daytime. So he was trying to get kids IDs who were actually, enrolled in the schools, and you had to show your ID to get in. And he was murdered by the Symbionese Liberation Army, by a terrorist group, for doing that. They then kidnapped the heiress to the Hearst Empire, William Randolph Hearst's granddaughter, Patty Hearst, kidnapped her from her own home and held her, not for ransom, but for political reasons. They basically said, we want you to end poverty. The rich father of, Patty Hearst, we want you to run a program to feed the poor. We want you to do this, to end the war in Vietnam, all this crazy stuff that he had no power to do. And the craziest thing was she joined this organization. Patty Hearst actually decided to join the SLA. They finally decided to let her go. And she said, no, I want to join you in your righteous cause. And she started robbing banks with them for a couple of years. She eventually got caught and, went on trial and was convicted, but she'd be pardoned in the 70s. But this just blew people's minds. It was like, what is happening in America? There's actually violent, groups, left-wing groups that are revolutionary. And it really destroyed the Democratic Party for a long time period and led to the rise of Reagan and the Republicans. Okay, I think we're pretty good on that. So we'll go ahead and go to the next one. I'm running out of time. So 1968, this is the year. If you could encapsulate the 60s in a single year, it'd be 1968. This is the moment when everything just didn't seem to be spiraling out of control. It was kind of like 2020, but I do have to say 2020 might even be crazier and worse. Here's what happened in 1968. Number one, the Tet Offensive. The Viet Cong launched the largest offensive of the war. They humiliate the US military, and it shakes up things in America. People start to lose faith in their government and the war in Vietnam and all that stuff. Assassinations. Martin Luther King was assassinated in April, and then Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in June. And it was just a dagger in the heart of every liberal who wanted to bring the country together and end the war in Vietnam and bring about racial justice. Then you have the Democratic National Convention. Now, it's Oscar season, and Netflix has a lot of these. I just started to watch this movie this morning, in fact, so I haven't finished it, but it's really good so far. The Trial of the Chicago Seven. This is the trial. They don't actually show what happened at the Democratic Convention. They show the trial and the aftermath, and you kind of piece it together. Highly advise you guys watch it if you're interested in history in the 60s. It's great, and you'll love it. There's great stars in it. The DNC in 1968, the Democratic National Convention, was a circus. It was just insane. The craziest convention in American history. So it was held in Chicago. Mayor Daley, who was a Democrat, but kind of a Andrew Cuomo Democrat, if you guys get the reference, kind of a open jerk who was into revenge and ruining people's lives and stuff like that, real hard ass, so to speak. Mayor Daley decided he was not going to have a riot in his city, and he was going to crack down on all the people. And every crazy left-wing group came to Chicago in 1968. The Yippies, the Youth International Party, was there. This is Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. They're kind of not so much political people as they are sort of performance artists. They were just there to antagonize people, right? They published a little pamphlet called Steal This Book, and it was, 10 steps to create anarchy in America. And it was just sort of silly stuff. They were just there to get attention, and they didn't really have any political ambitions, but it terrified a lot of people. The Black Panthers were there. SDS was there. The Weathermen were there. All kinds of left-wing radicals were there. And they could not march in the convention hall. They couldn't march outside the convention hall. Mayor Daley said, you have to stay over, in Grant Park and kind of the public areas. And then Mayor Daley ordered his police to go out and essentially use incredibly violent brutality, right? All the people we don't like in America are right in one location, and we got them cordoned off and surrounded, shoot to kill. Now, miraculously, no one was actually killed, but people saw live on TV the police instigate a riot. It wasn't actually the left-wingers who were rioting, who came there to create trouble. The police actually just started to go in and crack heads, brutalize people. Blood was running in the streets of Chicago. They announced this on the floor of the convention. They said, I don't know if anyone knows this, but police are brutalizing young people in the streets of Chicago. And we think that we should end this convention and hold it at another time in another place where it's not under siege like this. And then something really crazy happened. The Democratic Party, Lyndon Johnson decided he wasn't going to run again. He could have, but he decided not to. His vice president, Hubert Humphrey, was running. Now, this is a weird time before primaries were much more democratic. This was when primaries were just sort of like, almost like polls, right? Like if you guys don't know what primaries are, in an election year, the parties have to decide who's their candidate to run. Now, in the olden days, you'd have a private convention of elected officials and they just meet in a back room and just make a deal and they nominate someone. Then starting in the 20th century, they started to have actual primary elections where you go state by state and Democrats or Republicans from that state would vote and you'd earn delegates. And at the convention, you'd build up a delegate count and you'd get the nomination. The 60s were sort of this hybrid period where you had primary elections, but they didn't mean anything. Now, one of the candidates was murdered midway through the primary, process, Robert Kennedy, and he had a pretty high delegate count, but people wanted to know who those delegates went to. Eugene McCarthy had the second most. He was a peace candidate. He wanted to end the Vietnam War immediately, negotiate and get out. Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson's vice president, wanted to continue the war and win it. And even though Humphrey did not win a single primary, they had been split between Bobby Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy. The party decided to just overrule what the citizens in the Democratic Party wanted and to nominate Hubert Humphrey anyway. When this was announced, there was a fist fight, huge one, on the floor of the Democratic Convention. The people who supported Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy felt that the nomination had been stolen from them. They were enraged and they started to punch it out with Humphrey supporters. And there were these old 60-year-old men rolling around on the floor in a big scrum, just punching each other. Now, to the average American looking at that, and then the Republican one was held the next month, and it was bland and boring the way that Americans like it. They held it in Miami, and it was really colorless. Most people looked at that, and again, the Democratic Party was dominant in America at the time, but a lot of people looked at it and said, what happened to my party? My party used to be the party of the working man, right? The working class, union individual, improving people's living. Now it's a bunch of freaks. We're embarrassed to be Democrats. They're fighting on the floor of the convention. That's not respectful. That's not dignified. And so there were lifelong Democrats that either stayed home in '68 or they voted for Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon barely eked out a victory, just barely. It was a three-way race, actually. Humphrey did very well, but narrowly lost. Nixon will win, but this third party candidate, George Wallace, ran. George Wallace was running as sort of a reform segregationist. He was the governor of Alabama in the 60s and had been a hardcore segregationist. After the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were passed, he sort of changed his tune, but he was running as sort of a hardcore conservative. He was saying, we need to nuke North Vietnam until the North Vietnamese glow. That's a pretty ugly picture, but that's what he ran on. He wanted to crack down on hippies. He wanted to, all that stuff. He does not win, but he wins something like 5 southern states, and he siphons off enough support from Humphrey that Nixon becomes president. So I want you to note this. We have this idea that the 60s was all about hippie radicalism and tie-dye and burning your draft card. Most America was not like that. Most America was buttoned down, conservative, lean Democrat, but decided on these social issues that they just had had enough, and they wanted to vote for Richard Nixon. And even when he won, even a lot of liberals said, well, let's give the guy a shot. Maybe he can win, right? Lyndon Johnson was a liar. Maybe Richard Nixon would win. Well, it turns out Richard Nixon is more crooked than any president we ever had in history. But people didn't know that yet at the time. The Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia had a revolution in 1968 in the summer, and the Russians rolled the tanks in and just brutally crushed it. So this was really kind of a warning to a lot of Americans. A lot of Americans on the left would march in the streets with communist flags of the Viet Cong, saying, they were the good guys and we're the bad guys in Vietnam. And then things like this would remind you that the Soviets were probably even worse than us. I would say definitely worse than us. And it was all live on TV. Everybody watched the Prague Spring. Everybody had great hope that Czechoslovakia might be liberated. And the Soviet tanks just rolled in and brutally crushed and killed tens of thousands of people. And it was just ugly. And there was nothing we could do about it. The Olympics were held in Mexico City that year. And something very shocking happened. In the track and field event, 2 Black athletes decided they were going to protest and not salute the flag when they won the gold and silver medals. They instead, when the national anthem played, they raised their fist in a sort of Black Power salute. And like the national anthem is today, it was incredibly politicized and people were very angry at that, right? Just like Colin Kaepernick refuses to, stand for the national anthem. When these guys did that, immediately white America said, well, you don't love your country, which these people said, no, our country doesn't love us. We love America very much and want to be part of it, but we're just tired of being second-class citizens and we want to protest. And what better time to use the Olympics when 10 billion people are watching across the globe, right? It very much drove a wedge between white and Black America. France nearly had a revolution that year. It was sort of like communism and capitalism. Czechoslovakia would fall and France would fall, and that the whole system would be torn down and we would rebuild it as this wonderful society. It didn't have a revolution, but it came really, really close. Students and union workers marched together and very nearly topped the Fifth Republic in 1968. Didn't happen, but came very close, and it was really frightening. People at the time thought they were living in the middle of a global revolution. It didn't turn out to be that way, but everything under the sun that could happen that year happened. And then Nixon won the race. So 68 was a pretty crazy year. I think I might have to give the edge to 2020 simply because I lived in 2020 and it was a pretty bananas year. And we had the same political turmoil, right? We had an insurrection at the Capitol. I guess that's technically 2021, but it was at the end of the 2020 race. We had a pandemic. We had a bad economy. We had a war in Afghanistan going on. We had a lot of the same things going on. All right, Vietnamization. So I'm running out of time. I got to wrap this up. So Nixon, I could go into this a lot, but Nixon was a bit of a weasel. He won the election by and large by sort of manipulating events. He did this weird thing where he sent delegates secretly to go meet with the South Vietnamese because there was actually negotiations going on to end the war all during 1968. South Vietnam was meeting with North Vietnam and they were trying to broker out a peace agreement. Nixon secretly had liaisons meet with the South Vietnamese and said, don't sign that agreement. I'll get you a better one. Wait until I'm president. The idea being, if the war drags on, the Democratic Party will lose support and I'll win the election and I'll get a better deal, right? He wasn't able to get a better deal. It was a cynical ploy. It dragged out the war. It got people killed needlessly. We might have gotten out of the war 4 years earlier when far fewer people had been killed. Nixon got in there and very dishonestly immediately announced, we can't stay. We're going to get out. And he does. He starts this process of what was called Vietnamization. Vietnamization meant that we are going to withdraw our troops, but we're going to step up aid to the South Vietnamese army. They're going to have to win it on their own. We'll give them all the modern weapons of war, napalm, planes, machine guns, everything they need, but we can't fight and win this war for them. So Nixon gradually started withdrawing soldiers. About every week, a few thousand would come home, and at the same time, step up the bombing and the aid to South Vietnam. Well, it didn't work. The invasion of Cambodia, we captured a lot of weapons, but it didn't seem to work, make the country any safer. And it stimulated a lot of anger and backlash in America. When Nixon announced that we were going to invade Cambodia to clear out Viet Cong sanctuary areas, students went nuts on college campuses. Students burned down the ROTC building at Kent State in Ohio. And the next day, the National Guard came out to restore law and order. There was a violent confrontation, and 5 students were shot and killed at Kent State. And it was tragic and it was horrific. Very interesting that it was the 200-year anniversary of the Boston Massacre. Boston Massacre was 1770, this was 1970. Same number of people were killed, 5, right? In an incident between armed soldiers and, protesters. And again, the protesters were not peaceful. They were hurling rocks and all kinds of stuff. There was tear gas, it was confusion. The soldiers missed. They were fighting or shooting, in panic, and they accidentally hit some kids who were all the way across campus, just minding their own business. And it was ugly and tragic. And when the news came out about that, there were riots on every college campus in America. Over 100 campuses, this was in May, before finals, over 100 campuses just closed their doors and sent letters to every student that said, we cannot guarantee safety on this campus and we're shutting them down. Come back in August when things have calmed down. J. Edgar Hoover went to Richard Nixon and said, I cannot guarantee the safety of this country if you continue the war. You need to get every National Guard and soldier back in America, because there's still, the riots were going every summer. There was a riot in a Black neighborhood in America and the National Guard had to be called out. And now the students were burning down cities. And he said, there will be a revolution in this country if you don't end the Vietnam War. And Nixon decided at that moment he was bringing the troops home. So we continually did that. And finally, in January of 73, we get our peace agreement, and it's a horrible peace agreement. It's a sellout, but it was the best we were ever going to get. Now, Nixon tried to sell it as a victory, right? That we have peace with honor, but in reality, the only troops that had to leave were the American troops. North Vietnamese troops could stay in South Vietnam, and they did not behave themselves after the Americans left. It was said in there that South Vietnam was one country with two governments, that the Viet Cong was rightfully half of the legal government of South Vietnam. And we agreed to that. We signed to it on paper. But we were done. We had spent 8 years and lost 58,000 soldiers. And, you know, America will take great sacrifices when they believe that the sacrifice is worth it and just, and they will not if they think it's useless. Most Americans could not wrap their head around why the heck we were there, just like Afghanistan. Does it make us any safer to have that war going on and prop up the government? Now, I do not want the Taliban to win. It's going to be awful for democracy. It's going to be awful for women. It's going to be awful for human rights if that government collapses and the Taliban come back in. But we can't stay there forever. And here at home, it's not really going to affect us that much if we just have beefed up security at our airports and everything else. You know, Afghanistan's a world away. People felt the same thing for Vietnam. Who the hell cares if the communists take over Vietnam? And Lyndon Johnson would say, yeah, but the domino effect. First, it'll be Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, then Thailand, maybe Japan will fall. And before you know it, they'll be invading San Francisco. Communists will be swimming over the Rio Grande from Mexico into America. We have to draw the line here, which most people by the late 60s said, that's a fantasy. That was part of the Red Scare of the 50s. You were terrifying the hell out of us. This movement is not even about global communism. The Vietnamese hate the Chinese. Read a book. They hate the Chinese more than they hate us. Ho Chi Minh said it as much. He said, if the Americans make peace with us, I'll invite them back for tea tomorrow. But the Chinese are never welcome to come back. Chinese dominated Vietnam for 1,000 years. We were there for 8 years, and so we weren't hated nearly as much. It wasn't about ideology. It was about nationalism. It was about, you do not get to tell us what to do because we are Vietnamese and you're not. That's what it was about to them. To us, it was, no, you're allied with the Chinese and the Russians. Well, the Chinese and Russians gave them weapons, but Ho Chi Minh said, I don't want a single soldier of yours in my country, and you're not coming in. And do a little thought experiment. Would it be accurate to say that George Washington was just a tool of Louis XVI and French imperialism and the monarchy? I would say certainly not, even though he was our major patron and gave us a huge amount of money and weapons. It's just his interests coincided with ours, which is the same thing for Ho Chi Minh. He certainly was a communist, but he was not a strong ally of the Soviet Union or China. It was ridiculous to say so. But America had a lot of arrogance back in the 60s. We had won every war. We were the richest country, most powerful country. We were right off of World War II, and we just thought we could do anything. And Vietnam was really a wake-up call to us that despite our power, money, wealth, prestige, there were limits to what we could achieve, and we still had to pick our battles. Our resources were finite, and we had to just let certain things go if they weren't worth it in the end. And that's how Vietnam would end, in disgrace. When the US withdrew from Vietnam in January of 73, the country collapsed 2 years later. When the North Vietnamese start their offensive, they felt that they had planned that it would take 2 years to conquer South Vietnam. It took 55 days. South Vietnam collapsed before they could even issue a surrender. It's incorrect to say that South Vietnam surrendered to North Vietnam. The entire leadership of South Vietnam fled the country, most of them to America, some to France. And there was no one to even issue a surrender. When the communists marched into the presidential imperial palace in April of 75, there was no one to greet them. It was embarrassing. We had long left, and we were trying to ferry people out of the embassy and other places. And like the French did 20 years before, we tucked our tail between our legs, humiliated, and went home. It was a horrible propaganda win for the communists. They get to humiliate us and say, the Americans aren't serious. They won't stay and protect you. So we're still dealing with that legacy today. The Vietnam syndrome is this fear that Americans have to get involved in these long protracted conflicts. And Afghanistan and Iraq have only made it worse. It's very hard to build a government, and it's very easy to topple a government. It's hard to build one and cement loyalty to it and build a regime that the people there will like. It's very hard to do that with the military. So that is the 60s. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that crazy decade that would shape America for, the modern era. We'll move on to the 70s next time, and it'll be pretty cool. We'll get the disco music and the platform shoes out. It'll be wonderful. You guys will love the 70s. All right, then. Have a good one, guys. Bye-bye.